Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we are going to be talking about the kind of technical infrastructure required to manage latency for multiplayer PvP games. Now, to speak to these issues, we have two superstars. First, we have Zach Blitz, head of infrastructure and live ops at one of my favorite game companies of all time, Riot Games, and Glenn Fiedler, founder and CEO of Network Next, and considered to be one of the world's best netcode guys, right? Right, Glenn?
It's more about my mustache these days.
Just to set the stage, kind of one of the things that we've been seeing increasingly has been the rise of more social and multiplayer and PvP games. And I thought we could start with thoughts about the current state of technical infrastructure for truly competitive PvP multiplayer games. And in particular, we could start with, how difficult is a challenge to ramp up an infrastructure for competitive PvP? And what are some of the key variables that increase or decrease the difficulty of this problem? And maybe we could start with you, Zach.
Yeah, it's interesting, especially with cloud proliferation. If you have a knowledgeable distributed systems engineer, DevOps person, architect, the design and scale up and ongoing maintenance at a smaller studio isn't super heavy as long as you go with the cloud. I would not suggest going into the data center business unless you have extremely deep pockets or you need to go where the cloud is not. But most of the problems that you're going to face are business or product or game design problems. And there's generally two main considerations when ramping infra. The first is the experience you want players to have. And that usually means competitive integrity, which is that everyone has a level playing field. And what makes things complex there is how you define a level playing field. For Valorant, we defined it as sub 50 milliseconds globally to eliminate peaker's advantage. And that made life extremely difficult for us because of the second consideration, which is where your players are. And at Riot, we serve a global ecosystem of players. Let's look at Europe for a second. Europe is generally easier to ship latency sensitive games to because it's physically smaller. Population centers are reasonably close together, and it has a pretty robust cloud and metal presence. The United States, by comparison, is enormous physically, and population centers are spread way out. And to simplify the Valorant problem, if your data center is in Chicago, you have a player in Akron and a player in Miami, is the playing field truly level? Do you introduce latency for the person in Akron? Like, we would never do that, just from a values perspective. So do you account for that with matchmaking, or do you spend more money on infra in Atlanta so that players can play fairly? And we certainly chose the latter. But now you start to see how, especially in the United States, launching a PvP game is expensive and really difficult. But the problems are more business product game related than they are technological. And I'll give one more example, and Glenn, feel free to riff. Like, we've been pretty public about an MMO, and that introduces a whole new set of challenges for us. Like, imagine for a second two people about to fight an open world game with no signal to our infrastructure that it's about to happen. We've never done a sessionless competitive experience. How does PvP combat work when we don't know the location of the participants that are about to fight? How do we make that fair? Do we just let one person get wrecked because they're in Boise, Idaho versus like Terre Haute, Indiana? And I think the answer to that would certainly be no. But these are some of the considerations and challenges that I think make it pretty complex.
Right. And Zach, before going on to Glenn, could you also, for the audience that's not familiar with Peaker's Advantage, could you
Sure.
go into what that is and what impact that has on gameplay?
Yeah, sure. So the classic SPS challenge is something called Peaker's Advantage, and it games like Counter-Strike and its predecessors, I think, had a lot of it. And basically, it's when a player peeks or looks around a corner first, because of the way the internet works, they will see their opponent before the person who is standing there sees them. So what Valorant's thesis really was is if we eliminate peakers' advantage to the best of our ability globally, that players will really, really want to play a game where that is true. And for the
Right.
most part, we've done it, but it's very difficult.
Got it. Glenn?
Hey, cool. So let me give maybe a completely different point of view. So I'm a little bit unique in that I straddle both the business and the design and the engineering side, and I can maybe give a holistic view, and also maybe skewed more towards people who don't necessarily have the resources of Riot Direct, which is a massive advantage for Riot, and I fully acknowledge. So the first thing I'd really like to say is, look, the number one thing is your game fun? That's it. Is the design compelling? Will people stay around? Will they have high engagement? And will they not churn out? That's absolutely number one. And if you don't do that, nothing else matters. You must have a fun game. And then after that, here's maybe the next most important thing. And I'll think within the realm of what we're talking about, it's intelligent selection of where you host servers. And trust me, you will distribute servers in the United States across Seattle, Los Angeles, Chicago. You will go to New York. You will go to probably Virginia, Miami. You'll definitely go Sao Paulo, Brazil. In the United States, in Europe, you'll definitely be thinking about UK, Amsterdam, Frankfurt at minimum. Middle East is a little tricky. South America outside of Sao Paulo is definitely a little bit tricky. And then you go to APAC, and holy cow, everybody, get your servers in Singapore, right? Because Singapore is a big deal for APAC region, especially for Western Australia, right? And Eastern Australia, Sydney, is a good location itself, but there's something really cool coming up that I'm very excited about. Is in addition to Singapore being a hub, there's this company called OneCode, OneQODE, and they're actually setting up regional server hosting in Guam, which used to be an internet exchange. And that is central, latency-wise, to a lot of countries, including Australia, Japan, China, etc., right? So the general trend here is that you want to try to find servers that kind of satisfy like a gravity sink, people around them regionally. And then you want to try to subdivide that when you find that latency isn't good enough. And hey, mainland China is even trickier because you can't host servers in there unless you have a game license, right? So there's a lot of regional complexities in the Middle East infrastructure. Oh boy, right? Through politics or geopolitical situation, there's not necessarily a lot of great connectivity between countries in that region. And sometimes the routes by default that they get to servers, even in their own region, I see people in Dubai going to Frankfurt on the way to Dubai. So that's what's called a hairpin. So what do we got? Fun game, absolutely number one. Geographically distributed servers, and I literally just told the locations that you'll need, right? And then the next thing is matchmaking. How are you making sure that people are playing together? And alluding to your point, I personally think everyone under 50 milliseconds is having a great time. And I think at a pinch, you could say less than 100 milliseconds is essential. It's like it's essentially, look, what's the latency above which where you're feeling that your players are not having a good experience? And you can look at the data. You can look at the data and you can back it up, and you look at retention and engagement curves. And you can actually look at the point where people churn out because they're having a bad experience. So,
right.
And matchmaking is the first thing to rule out. So it's fun game, excellent server locations, really excellent matchmaking that's trading off skill versus the time to find a match versus distance or latency. And then only after all of that is solved, you can get really strong benefits from Riot Direct or a competing product. Well, not really competing per se, very different. But if you're not Riot, there's an advantage that you're missing because Riot has something that you don't have. Riot has the ability to say the internet route is terrible for no fault of the player and no fault of the server, and to say, take our private internet that we've built, five or 6 years of work on this, tens of millions of dollars every year.
I would say closer to 10, but yeah.
This is not something that I'm going to open even a small AAA studio. I'm not going to start by building this.
Yeah,
Right?
I mean,
It's a big investment for you guys.
agree, and honestly, financially, it was kind of crazy to build that initially because nobody did that, and we were just so frustrated playing games that we all loved where the internet wasn't optimized for gaming, so we built it in house, which I don't think a lot of studios, even I don't know if Riot today would have made the same decision to go build it. That said, though, I do think cloud proliferation is different today than it was then. Like you can stand up some sort of AWS presence or GCP or Azure presence in almost every spot that you just listed, where 10 years ago when we built that, we couldn't. Right. And that's also part of the reason why we built that. So, I mean, I think Glenn and I think are largely saying the same thing. It's like, what experience you want players to have, and like, where are your players? And those population centers, put your servers there, and you can generally get to a good spot in terms of latency and fairness.
Right.
Yeah. I've actually got an additional point I could make to back this up. I actually have some data I can share. And this is from a game launch in 2021 on bare metal in these very locations. We found that 83% of players on the public internet, even to the best bare metal and cloud data centers in 2021, had high latency defined as greater than 50 milliseconds or packet loss greater than 1% at some point every week. So I would sort of step up and say, it's really great that the cloud offerings are better. It's really great that you can open up servers and you don't have to build your own data centers necessarily. But there's something afoot still, which is the BGP, the default internet routing protocol.
Oh, yeah.
Man, there's a perverse incentive out there. They take the cheapest route, not the best one for your players. And that's why, honestly, I think every game needs something like Riot Direct, because that's what fixes that.
Right.
Yeah. It's interesting because there's a bunch of businesses that have tried to open up in that space and they just haven't generally found traction. I don't know if that's because they're aimed at AAA studios as opposed to the little guy, but it's been it's interesting to have watched that space. I think over the last few years, I would say too that the question on like what's wrong with networking. I think that's a really good question. I know.
I'll settle with this statement. The public internet treats your gaming the same as someone reading their email. And that's why 83% of people every week get high latency or packet loss. And we have hard data tying that same threshold of latency and packet loss to 3 times reduced engagement and 3 times increased churn.
Okay.
So I think there's an opportunity out there for people making games when they have a fun game, when they've selected good regions for server hosting, and when they're comfortable that their matchmaking is doing the best job and they've tuned it specific to their game design. There is, as a number 4, and it's not number 1, right? But as a number 4, there's definitely benefit to, okay, but there's like 1% of my players at any time are getting, maybe even 2 to 5%, depending on your game, are getting an experience correlated with 3 times lower engagement and 3 times higher churn. Fix that. And if someone comes along and offers something that's cost effective, that fixes that, I think that's a winner. Game buyers are not going to go and build Riot. There's not going to be 50 Riot Directs for every, it's not going to happen, right? But there's an opportunity for something that's really cost effective that targets, honestly, like price sensitive game developers making money off a live service product. This is something that has to be turnkey and reasonably priced. And that's what I'm trying to create with Network Next.
Got it. So maybe we could talk about that topic around like the smaller developer. Mm-hmm. Is it realistic for a small developer? So I'm with a small developer, and when it comes to trying to develop a game that is, let's say, sub 50 milliseconds or sub 100 milliseconds, how should we be thinking about trying to create a competitive game? Is the kind of infrastructure, because we don't have things like Riot Direct and all the resources of a big company like Riot, how should we be thinking about developing our infrastructure? What do you guys think?
Can I take this one initially, and I'll kick it to you, Zach? There's an amazing amount of really good stuff out there in Google Cloud, AWS, and Azure. And as a small indie studio, focus on making the game fun. Right. Focus on making the game fun, play tested, and hosted in Google Cloud, the premium tier networking for Google is actually really, really good. We find it to be the best out of the three clouds. And you don't need to go to bare metal to be a serious game. You can get really good performance out of cloud. And the network performance of the cloud is actually, in general, superior to the bare metal performance that you'll get by default with the medium tier hosting company. So I would suggest if you're sub 10K CCU, just get it into a cloud, pay the transit fee, pay the cents per gig, which is higher than you'd like, and know that you're getting better than default internet networking in a hosting company like Google Cloud. That's my recommendation.
Yeah, the interesting thing about the question too is like, for us, we're trying to be more industry standard. We built a lot of custom things to roll out League of Legends, but things that we use that are pretty ubiquitous. I mean, Val launched, I would say 60 or 70% on AWS. And that's compute databases, managed Kubernetes, Route 53. We use Terraform, we use Docker, we use Cloudflare, we use New Relic, we use GitHub. I mean, all of these things, right, are cheap or free, depending on the tier that you're using them at. Things you can't do that we do, like physical data centers, like I would probably not do that. And all that entails from a management perspective, inclusive of like the software to run it and people. That's a lot. And then Riot Direct, obviously we've spoken about that a bit here. But I would say that like what Glenn advised, I mean, AWS has latency sensitive products as well, that they can help with. Most of the clouds have offerings that can get you there. And, we manage our stack using pretty standard tools and trying to get more standard every day.
Right. And then just speaking about the network infrastructure, I know it's been steadily improving over the years, and we've got things coming like whether it's Starlink or what Glenn's working on with Network Next. But is there anything in particular that we should be looking out for, or any other thing that we can do whether it's as a small developer, a bigger developer, to address some of the challenges on the network side?
I mean, I think the current state of the ISP ecosystem regarding speed and stability, it's like, speed, they generally send traffic the cheapest route for them. Glenn's kind of covered this. It hurts competitive games.
Right.
It's not a technical problem. It's a problem of incentive for a network that has no incentive other than to treat your traffic as if a route. They could just be like 50% of traffic goes left and 50% goes right.
Right.
Depending on the hash of your IP and your port and the distance. You could have from one game to the next plus or minus 50 or 100 milliseconds just because they load balance you down Route A instead of Route B. And to them, an additional 50 or 100 milliseconds is okay.
Yeah.
Right? This is the internet today, everybody.
And I think the problem that Glenn's company is solving is a real one. Like I have this theory that in the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be a big split in this country between like the boomers and probably Gen X and younger, because the boomers don't care about this routing thing, right? They get their 50 to 100 milliseconds. They can watch, whatever videos they want on YouTube or go on Facebook. It really doesn't affect them.
Let's face it, I've already got half a second response time when I press a button anyway.
Yeah. But there's going to be games that come out, or AR or VR experiences.
Oh my God. You're going to throw up. You're going to throw up because of a network glitch. And people will be cleaning up puke.
And we as we as a country are not going to be able to participate in those things the same way as Asian or European countries are, because our internets are slower and our ISPs are not getting less monopolistic. And that's going to create a generational divide in this country, and a potential political nightmare if not solved. I hope things like Starlink can bridge the gap, but I think it's going to become an absolute problem for our country. And I think one that people outside of working in the internet in video games don't, I think, really understand.
So let me sort of step up here. There's actually really, the Starlink thing leads on to a really interesting sort of like what is really going on, right? And here's what's going on. There's the last mile, and the last mile is your ISP. They have a data center called a head end, So it's a data center somewhere, probably one Wilshire or whatever in LA, and there's points where they all connect there. And BGP is a thing that kind of works out how it gets from the head end to wherever it's going on the end. He's like, you're on Comcast, you're not on Comcast's internet. You're really only Comcast to the nearest head end, and then it goes IP, and then BGP is going to route you stupid, right? It's going to route you like, hey, he's checking his email now, right? She's browsing the web. No, you're playing Valorant. Well, in this case, you guys are taking it from the head end, and you're saying, no, internet, don't do that. Go on our private network from A to B, okay? And Network Next is kind of the same thing. Now, we can't currently fix the last mile, but the middle mile from LA to Chicago, man, a lot of stuff can go wrong between, and that's a city to another city, and I can tell you just the perverse incentives, the things that I see in the United States and Europe at scale with games we're working with. I mean, I feel like Rutger Hauer here. Like, I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Like, attack ships on fire. Like, this is absolutely crazy out there. Some people just get randomly 300 milliseconds for no good reason, and they're in LA.
Right.
It's nuts. Sometimes people get an additional 300 milliseconds for 4 days because a route went down for an ISP and they're routing them around the country the wrong way. And you can't, as a game developer, call somebody up and say, hey, Comcast, my game's on fire. Can you? So I totally understand why Riot Direct was created. It solves a real problem. And I don't see the solution for this coming from the network itself. I see a way with my company, but there's no guarantee that we succeed. But the thing that I'm really hoping to solve first is the middle mile, so that we can kind of say, look, guys, hey, this traffic is actually different. It has different characteristics to reading email. Please treat it differently, and let me create an incentive for you so that you're paid when you do. And that's what I'm trying to do. Now, the last mile stuff, wow, Starlink breaking the last mile monopoly, it's brilliant. It's really smart. It's breaking that fiber optic or DSL last mile. And Starlink is not, you're not going up and then to the game server. You're going up. I'm in upstate New York right now. I have Starlink and I use it as a backup. I go up to Starlink and then I go down to NYC or Secaucus, right? And that's the hop that the satellite does. And then the rest is regular wired stuff. Now, eventually Starlink is going to have intra-satellite links, so I can go up and then go around the world, potentially full speed of light in a vacuum. People don't know this, but you're 2/3 speed of light inside a fiber optic cable due to refraction. So even if you've got a direct line of sight from one point to another, theoretically, if the difference between 2/3 and full speed of light is less than the up-down to the satellite with the low Earth orbit satellites, Starlink might get you faster Japan to New York times when you're playing. I'm really excited about that. What do you think, Zach?
Yeah, I mean, especially the implications it has for things like an MMO, sessionless games with thousands of people in combat scenarios. I mean, I just remember playing WoW, 10 years ago, and instances basically crashing as soon as the fight would start because of internet issues or servers being overloaded or whatever. I think it starts to open up another arms race for what PvP means, which could be really, really exciting.
So you see higher player counts and more engagement across distance being opened up by increases in both bandwidth, but also better routing across distance to perhaps a central location.
Yeah, I think especially I think a lot obviously about our player base when it's just the frame of reference I have. I would say most of them are interested in being the best in the world. Or to know that they're among the best in the world at whatever they're doing.
For this. People talk to me all the time about this. They're like, I don't want to play in the little leagues. I don't want to play in the minor leagues. I want to play in the major league. I want to play, and that's why when you guys had league and you did everybody in the United States going to Chicago, that was so smart. That was really smart.
It's a super controversial decision. I think one that our pros would tell you, they still, are pretty open about not liking, just because the pros are based out of LA. But the reality was that was the fairest point for everybody. And so, that's what we're trying to, provide competitive global esports. And I think things like Starlink, et cetera, provide a more level playing field globally. Potentially, getting rid of regions, which is something
That's
that's
huge
been
because
a bit of an albatross for a
it's
long
totally
time.
like North America, South America, APAC, Middle East, Europe. I mean,
Right.
it's very much regional right now, isn't it?
Yes, and obviously the language barriers to a certain extent do help to create that. But I mean, in games like Valorant that have pretty sophisticated ping systems in terms of like what you can signal to players, like I mean, there are ways for us to play without having to speak the same language. So it's interesting.
Do you
It's
do you do the
certainly
same central
yeah.
hosting thing for Valorant, or do you have more locations for servers in Valorant? Because it is a lot with that peaker's advantage. It is a lot more latency sensitive.
I think if we had League to do over again, we would have more server locations than we do. I think the reality is we and but for Val, yes, we certainly have highly distributed server locations just based on the nature of the game and the way that population centers are distributed.
Speed of light.
Yeah, all that, all that stuff. But yeah, I think yeah, it's been, and actually I did a thing for reInvent this year on AWS Outpost. That was a critical a bit thing that helped us, a product that helped us roll out in time, especially because the speed of metal in specific locations was vital to launching that game at the millisecond target that we wanted.
That's awesome. So you actually found that your game was so latency sensitive that you had to work with a specific bare metal option with AWS to get the perf you needed.
Yeah,
That's
so
cool.
yeah, well, it was also a supply chain problem. I mean, there were a couple things that
So
went
like with
into it.
COVID last year and all that,
Exactly. It was
that's
like,
tough.
who am I betting on? Am I betting on Riot
Yeah,
supply chain to get servers and
I think
network in a
Amazon's going to
spot,
win
or
there.
Amazon? Yeah, and I I opened the checkbook and we paid the money, but that is exactly, that was the
Yeah,
calculus,
dude.
right? Yeah.
Smart
So
call. Very
yeah.
smart call.
Yeah.
Right.
But I mean, I think also like the ease of ramping up on that versus having to, install an OS on every box. And, there's a lot that goes into spinning up your own infra just from a time perspective, rack and stack, the whole nine. So, I'm sure there's vendors out there who are going to listen to this and be like, I could have done it in 45 seconds for you. But, I think we have a very specific SKU that we need to order and install.
Yep.
Guys, maybe we could talk a little bit more about, like, you guys have been recommending using cloud-based solutions, but for some of these bigger companies still do have on-premise based infrastructure. And so when you think about, what are if we can dive a little bit more deeply into what the advantages are, or are there advantages of still having on-premise based stuff? And then, what does that mean, or what specifically does cloud give you
I
versus on-prem?
I actually don't know any companies that I work with, at least, who actually manage their own data centers, except perhaps Valve and Riot, and maybe EA.
Yeah.
I think some of the bigger
Which
console
so,
guys
yeah.
do.
I'll give a
Yeah.
little bit, like, when I think about cloud providers, right?
Yeah.
Like, for stability, they're great. If you've written some business logic to fail over gracefully, because they're going to take a node down you don't expect at some point, like, their business is really stability, so long as you're kind of smart about that, and that's their whole
Right.
pitch. It's like, we can run infra more reliably than you, and cheaper than you can. But, and I'll tell a story here, they don't care about latency at all. And I have a story about that. And I'm not going to mention names, but in the lead up to Val, we wanted to share some learnings about some of the latency studies we'd done and some latency reduction we wanted to do with a cloud provider to make their offering more attractive and to hopefully offload some work from us. And they kind of laughed at us and were like, this work is completely ungeneralizable to the rest of our customer base. and none of our customers care about latency; they care about stability.
Oh,
And
oh my God.
I know a couple. I know
This
at
kills
least a
me.
couple gaming companies that
Yeah.
are specific to this cloud provider
Yeah.
who absolutely care about latency. But I think latency is largely still a game maker's problem. And so when we talk about the decision on-prem versus cloud in specific areas of the world, right, especially ones that don't have a ton of cloud presence, metal or some metal hybrid like an Outpost really is your option if you want like to launch a highly latency sensitive game.
Can I give a shout out to some companies that I've worked with Network Next?
Please.
Like we've worked with StackPath, ZenLayer, Limelight. We work with Gcore around Russia, OneCode in APAC, and datapacket.com is really, really good. Servers.com, 100 TB, Total Server Solutions, Performive. There's a whole bunch of really good bare metal, but here's the challenge. Not all of them have all the locations you need. You'll have to have a heterogeneous infrastructure where some are in this, like Gcore in Russia, really good, right? ZenLayer, amazing in APAC and Asia, and obviously all of these are really good everywhere else. And like there are really good companies that will host servers for you and have good connect. And then there are some other ones that are really cheap, right? So let me sort of take this and like I've worked out like a really weird sort of thing. It's like, man, the cost of servers can be pretty high, even with bare metal. And with cloud, what happens is the monthly recurring cost is maybe a little lower, but you do tend to, at the scale of most people, get a little bit whacked by the egress bandwidth from that cloud. They hit you on a cents per gig on the cloud, on the bandwidth going out, which is tricky for games because we're paying a lot, we think, for the CPU. And the egress is usually down to the player is usually more than up. Right. So what happens is that when you're primarily considering the bare metal and the cloud decision, the simple fact is, look, the bare metal is going to be cheaper because you can buy that bare metal server and it has a certain amount of bandwidth of which you'll certainly stay below, built into the price with the typical medium and small scale, right? Like 100,000 peak CCU or roundabouts, very common size. When you're in cloud, you will find that like 4, 5, 6, 8, 10, 12 cents per gig adds up very quickly. So one way to look at Network Next is you can go and host in really cheap bare metal, and only for the 1% of players that get a massive improvement that's relevant for your game design, we can get you the performance of the absolute best servers in the locations where you are.
Yeah. Could I ask you guys a potentially controversial question about prem versus cloud? Do you guys think that for some of these bigger console companies that have been running on-prem infrastructure for a long time, that to some degree, do you think it might be a political decision not to move to cloud to retain jobs and things of that nature? Or is it generally just a technology choice?
That's a good question. I obviously, like, I don't think the general like sales pitch from the cloud provider is always, we're going to save you money. We're going to save you money. We're going to save you time, and we're going to save you a headache, and we're going to save you maintenance. The reality is, and we're in the full disclosure, we're in the middle of a cloud conversion ourselves, right? The reality is, you don't save money. It's about at cost. You don't always save labor because the work changes, right? And so I think the answer to that is probably no. I think like executives that are, who sit at my seat at other companies are generally really good at telling the truth about these things, which is that, look, the cloud provider is going to come in and they're going to give us, potentially millions of dollars of training credits. And we're going to try and take all the staff who really only know on-prem and try to convert them into DevOps engineers. And that's in the best interest of both the engineer and their future career, as well as the companies, because most of these people want to retain them, especially if they've been at the company for a long time and have good performance and all that stuff. So I don't think it's actually that controversial of a change internally. I do think, yes, there are people who are like, look, I've done metal my whole career, as with any change, right? In any industry, I've done this thing my whole career. I don't want to change. Like, I think there will always be those people, but I don't think it's like a political decision. I think most of the time when they look at it, I think it's more, they don't know where the skeletons are buried, and like changing out the physical infrastructure that they have is going to take so long to do, and like they don't know what's going to break when they do it, and it's been sitting there. I work with some people from Disney who are like, some of the some of the rides still run on like floppy disks, like and that's true. Like some of the Disney park like rides that you love run on floppy disks, and like the idea that like they'll ever change that out, like that once the ride is gone, they'll change, right? But they'll never like they're never gonna like try to figure out what some dude was thinking 20 years ago who's been gone from the company, like was figuring in the initial setup. I think that's usually the main thing that discourages companies from doing it. It's not like a cultural revolution.
It's more of a stability issue is what you're saying.
100%, yeah.
I can add an interesting take, and also I can talk a little bit about our own decision at Network Next, right?
Okay.
So let me start by saying, look, there's really two things you have to think about. Where are you hosting your backend, and where are you hosting your game servers? And they actually could be two different places. So for Network Next, our backend is written in Golang and runs natively in Google Cloud. And out of my cold, dead hands, right? Cold, dead hands. Like I love Google Cloud. We use BigQuery, PubSub. The Golang stuff that we do runs native. We don't use Kubernetes or Docker or any bullshit. Maybe that's controversial, right? But we just run native Golang instances as MIGs on Google Cloud and autoscale. And I tell you what, we are done. We are done, right? And we have a somewhat microservices-based architecture for horizontal scaling. And look, it works great. And I would never advise to anybody, you should build your own bare metal on-prem for a non-game server component. My recommendation is that when you're hosting your game servers, and someone else is running the data centers for you, and that's their business, you can get really good price performance from bare metal. And Network Next can help bridge the absolute best connectivity, sometimes from cloud, sometimes from other bare metal providers. But there's a cost decision to be made between the cents per gig egress from cloud, primarily for game servers, versus the bare metal bandwidth cost, which is typically much lower. So, but for the love of God, run your back end in a cloud, AWS or Google or Azure, I guess. But man, I love Google. Zach, you're an AWS guy.
We run both AWS and Google.
Okay, cool.
So yeah, but I think.
But you got to pick one though. Now we're getting controversial.
Now you're going to get me in trouble. You're going to get me in trouble with somebody. So yeah.
Team Google over here.
So in terms of the next topic, I thought we could talk about cost. And basically, there are some game types that are very expensive with respect to netcode, server operating costs that can potentially eat up a lot of margin as you're operating these games. And so in some situations, they can turn some games that, may have been fairly popular from a user demand perspective, but economically unviable. It could just be like games that have very low monetization on a daily basis, but your cost of operating could be higher. Now, I've heard that things are getting better where we don't have to be as careful. Like on some games in the past, we've even had to limit the number of events that we instrument to let's say 10, 15 events per DAO or something like that. And some console games will instrument 1,000 events per DAO. So I was wondering if you guys could talk about, when you think about cost relative to the type of game that you're operating, how do you guys think about cost for the games?
Yeah, I can go really macro, and I'm sure Glenn can go a little bit micro. So for us, we always start with our core principles, which is like we want players to have the best experience possible. The game needs to be fair and globally available, and then we optimize cost around that, right? Like
Okay.
very similar to what Glenn's been saying originally. Like build the fun game, like make
Right.
sure players really like it, and then you start to optimize. Um, this story is from 4 years ago. Okay, so this is like long before we even started the initial rollout of Valorant. Like when we looked at the cost modeling, we looked at 3 global millisecond latency targets, and ultimately we landed on the middle of costs. And the curve was pretty dramatic. The cheapest option was extremely Riot friendly. The middle option was extremely player friendly, and the last option was not really achievable from a cost perspective, um, or achievable based on internet in some areas of the world and the amount of effort. And we had a few people in on this meme in the office, but it was like we just can't build a data center in the center of the Amazon rainforest, and that some player would be upset at some point that we hadn't done it. But play it out for a second, right? Like let's say Valorant's margins are great, right? Are they great enough to build a data center in the Amazon rainforest regardless of your ethics? You'd have to get permits to destroy the rainforest. You'd have to pay for construction. You'd have to run fiber across a good chunk of Brazil. You'd have to cool it in the middle of the jungle. You'd have to buy
Yeah.
servers and import them, hire people to run it, maintain it for years, maybe long after the game is relevant. What's the exit strategy? Do you sell it? Like, how do you consider that? Do we even have staff like currently who could design this?
And then you have COVID come in too, giving you a nice wrench in the gears
Right.
there.
Your margin would have been gone in the first 10 seconds of what I
Mhm.
discussed. And so we spend a ton of Riot's money every year, whether it's in the initial like game design or launch or in our day-to-day lives with a game like League. We're constantly thinking about how we help the business save money and give that money back to players in terms of new games, new game modes, new cinematics, new
Right.
entertainment experience, etc. If we save $1 million, that's a whole new game dev team.
Right.
And that's a huge win for players. That's generally kind of the way that we think about it. So we spend a lot of time, kind of underneath the covers trying to optimize for players. But that's probably a little different of an answer
Right.
than I think you
But
were going for.
Zach, to that point that you just mentioned, though,
Yeah.
like to the point that if you're able to save money, that value can accrue back to the players. And so, in terms of that concept, like whether you're taking some functionality from the server and shifting it to client or things like that, what are some of the
Right.
things that you guys think about to try and save cost?
So one of the big ones right now is we're cleaning up from the Valorant launch where we'd split some routes, some network routes with AWS in certain parts of the world where they're preferring AWS versus Riot Direct. Obviously, we have a huge cost advantage if that traffic is moved to AWS, Riot Direct, because we're already paying for it, right, in
Right.
bulk, and we're paying for it in volume. And so one of the major things right now is we're trying to move that traffic back over to Riot Direct since we're not in launch mode. But that gets tricky because every time we have an event in Valorant, and there's been a couple this summer that have done really well in terms of player counts. Those sorts of things like drive demand. So it's like, well, okay, so when's the right time to actually shift the traffic over? So it's a lot of considerations like that, because we also don't want players to have a negative experience. Like, hey, we try to cut this route over to save money in the middle of like an event, and now we have a 2-hour outage. Like that's an absolute mess for players and something we would never want to incur. So though that's something we're doing even right now.
I got to say, like, look, like Zach, you hit it right there. There's this really really weird kind of, and I'm not talking about any specific game, especially not Riot, but like when you look at a lot of sort of the scarier fans, that it's like devs with their terrible netcode and then their broken servers, and like everything is, and it's like really, it's really not true. Like these are game development teams who are players themselves. They're super passionate about the games that they work on. A good example, Sammy Duke, lead online engineer on Apex Legends. Like that guy engages with fans on Twitter, and I think maybe 4 out of 5 times like there's like nasty replies, and he's just like, "Hey guys, I'm helping. How you doing?" And what's going on is that devs are not pinching pennies. Devs are not buying cheap servers. They're not like they're spending a lot of money on servers, and they're putting the player's experience first. Because if the players aren't having fun, they've got nothing. They've got absolutely nothing. But where it gets really challenging is when people hack games or when people DDoS games. What happens is that it drives costs up for game developers, and they have to spend more money on infrastructure and less money on making new items, new game modes, new events. And it's just and cheating as well, anti-cheat. I mean, all the effort put into anti-cheat could make a billion games, as far as I'm concerned.
Anti-cheat is
such a sad cycle.
$billion industry. Like both on the positive and the negative side, it's enormous.
People have opinions, and that's cool. But it's like the one thing I want to do is that as a dev myself, I want to stand up for the devs. It's like these are not people buying shitty cheap servers. These are people investing millions, tens, hundreds of millions to make your game as good as they can. And sometimes the internet just isn't giving you the best route. And honestly, it's probably not even the fault of your ISP. It's not. It's definitely not the fault of the dev.
Yeah,
and don't blame the dev, man. Far out. It's not the dev.
The hidden war here is like the dev versus the internet, right? Like it's and I think a lot of people don't see that. Like we had, I think in LATAM a couple weeks ago, like this fiber cut, right? Where it's, and the game's down for 12 hours. Luckily that doesn't happen in the United States as frequently probably as it used to. And like, there, we're getting killed on Twitter. Our devs are getting killed on Twitter.
But what's amazing is that you guys invested in your own dark fiber, for God's sake. Holy shit. You know how much money that is?
I know, but they don't, but all the player understands is, hey, my I can't play the game that I really want to play. And I got my friends together and we were supposed to do this. And I can empathize for the position, but to Glenn's point.
We always strive to do better, but like sometimes the reaction can be a little kind of like, you just got to, okay. Right?
Yeah.
Oh, I was just about to ask. So for like, I know at the bigger game studios, they have full anti-cheat teams and things of that nature. For a smaller game studio, how would you recommend that people address staffing or focus on anti-cheat security, things like that?
You should do a client server with a server authoritative networking with UDP, preferably with someone else's engine, and don't worry about it. That's a problem you want to have.
Yeah,
you need a scale to hit that you will not get until you've succeeded. And once you've succeeded, go for an off-the-shelf solution, and then on massive success, do what Riot do.
Yeah. Pay somebody to do it.
Got it. Okay.
Don't worry about DDoS. Don't worry about, but do the best practices. Don't do a client trusted network model in 2021. Don't trust the client.
Most cloud providers have some kind of DDoS solution that for a small dev is totally okay.
Okay. And final question from me, but when you guys think about, let's say, opening up new game server regions, how do you guys think about that? Do you have like minimum CCU requirements, or when is it time to open up the Amazon, Zach?
Yeah.
How do you guys think about that?
The players. How many players are there, and what's the improvement that can be provided?
Yeah, I think that's it. I think generally what we see, the way we do it, is we will see people playing our games with completely horrible experiences. Like I think the reason we opened up Middle East, which is I think our latest one, and I think we will go to South Africa at some point as well, which we're super excited about.
I didn't mention it because Africa is there's just so little there in terms of infrastructure and the players. And I mean, it's almost like there's like a little bit on the top and then a little bit on the bottom. There's a massive open, like there's a blue ocean there in Africa for someone to help improve connectivity, and everyone playing in that continent can be massively improved.
That's going to be a huge mobile region once there's infrastructure there. I would say for us, we were watching players in the Middle East basically struggle playing Valorant in Europe. and we were kind of like, this is unacceptable. We need to put servers in a place. Now, now picking locations within the
that's
Middle East
tough.
is super tough because all the countries do not play nicely together in terms of the internet exchanges, which is really difficult. And additionally, there's no real center. Like there's not like a Chicago, right? And it's big. Like we think of the Middle East, where we probably think a lot about like Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and not necessarily the entire Arabian Peninsula and things that go a little bit east. It's incredibly large geographically, almost the size of Europe. So, trying to figure out where we put it within, the servers within the Middle East is really challenging, and it's almost as geopolitical as it is like necessarily like latency based. And so a lot of these, to answer your question, Joseph, are like kind of region by region thoughts. You lead with like, hey, people are going to play the game. If we put it there, great, we'll put it there. But then like, how do we kind of deconstruct it and make it a really good experience? And most of these things are a work in progress. I mean, they're always.
I want to extend on Zach's point here. It's like people think that there's a relationship between distance and latency in all cases. That is not true. Like, I'll give you a very concrete example. I have many Korean friends and I have many Japanese friends, and because of this, I know that if you're a United States tourist in Seoul, you're not gonna make comments about how similar Korean culture is to Japanese culture. Those are two completely distinct and different cultures, although they have some similarities historically. And I can tell you that the two countries are actually quite different and also don't always get along. And there's a really horrible shared history that the Koreans are, like there's some reasons why the Koreans are not happy going back to the Second World War, right? And earlier. So is it somewhat surprising that the route between Seoul and Tokyo is not always the fastest one? It's political. Now, no one's out there going, it's just kind of like no one has the incentive. And we see other things like if you're hosted in Google Cloud and you're trying to go cross cloud to AWS, like you're not always going to get the fastest route between the two because who really cares about that? In fact, maybe they don't want it. I'm not saying that there's an intention here, but there's sort of like the internet is 100,000 different ASNs as of 2021, and they don't all like each other or to put it more politically, have really strong incentives to ensure that they have the best connectivity between their networks, right? So sometimes the path is a little weird. And then with 100,000 cooks in the kitchen, sometimes somebody in Dubai going to a server in Dubai goes through Frankfurt because that's the closest exchange. We actually have deployments in Middle East, and we're often able to fix all those Middle East to other Middle East regions. Like we have little mini pops in every city, and in every city we have 10 or 20 different providers with different connectivity, and we can steer through those points as we choose. So that's sort of like the magic of what we do, and it really helps in these geopolitical, areas where Israel and Egypt might not have the best connectivity between each other, and certainly not to Iran, right? And it's no fault of the people of Iran or the people of Egypt or the people of Israel. But and I'm pretty sure that everyone just wants great connectivity as people. But the internet does not have a straight line path physically between 2 points, and nor does it always have the best route picked between 2 points on the planet. It has its own topology, and that's influenced by geopolitics. And often the route is not what you think it should be. So sometimes just putting a data center in the Middle East won't actually get you what you need because you have all of the political stuff in the Middle East in addition. Like, you can deploy a lot of infrastructure to different points in the Middle East, but still those different points won't necessarily talk to each other because of geopolitical differences.
Okay. Well, guys, I think we're out of time, but I really want to thank both of you for this really in-depth discussion, a lot of incredible information. But in closing, do you guys have any final thoughts or recommendations for the audience? And how can people get in touch with you? Maybe starting with you, Zach?
Yeah, sure. I don't know. I think this is one of the most fun areas of game development today because I do think there's a lot of innovation happening in the space. We've talked about Riot Direct, we've talked about DDoS, we've talked about Infra. I think the cloud versus metal debate is going to continue. I think all of these things, especially as metal provider, kind of metal colo providers step up their managed service offerings. I think things like that are going to become super cool over the next 10 years. So just have fun with it. Have fun making games. I'm at Riot Z Blitz on Twitter. I just started that because people were like, players may want to get in touch with you. I have like 50 followers, so I think like 20 tweets. So, but I'm there, and I'm always happy to answer whatever questions you have. And if I can't answer it, I'll find somebody who's a pretty good expert who can help. So, but it's been a pleasure, Joseph. Thanks for having me on, man.
Yeah, thanks.
Cool.
Glenn?
Hey, so anyone who's interested in latency, DDoS, server hosting questions, what's it like? I'm launching my game, or I've already launched a game and I'm concerned about some of this stuff. What can I do? Even if it's just, like just general advice, what are you seeing with other games? Just reach out to Glenn, 2 N's, at networknext.com and I'll help you out.
Awesome. All right, guys. Well, there you have it. Zach Blitz, Glenn Fiedler, 2 world-class experts. Thank you so much for your time. Until next time, everybody. Bye.